What made you take 20 pregnancy tests? At 22 years old, I was a proud college virgin. So when fatigue and nausea hit during finals week, I thought it was just too much coffee and Panda Express. 8 weeks pregnant, the technician said, showing me the heartbeat on the screen. I laughed, explaining they'd made a mistake. But the doctor's expression shifted from routine to alarmed as she ordered immediate testing. Every test came back normal. Hormone levels, thyroid, everything perfectly of a pregnant woman. My mom accused me of lying when I told her, actually said, "Just tell us who the father is," in that disappointed voice she used when I was 16 and lied about a party. My dad sat silent, and my boyfriend Patty went from supportive to suspicious when I couldn't explain how this happened. I started recording myself sleeping, convinced I was doing something I didn't remember. Still nothing. The police opened an investigation after I begged them to do a grape kit, but the toxicology came back clean. I remember feeling almost disappointed. They ran DNA on the fetus, but the lab called it corrupted, then inconclusive, then finally admitted they'd never seen results like this. Couldn't even confirm it was fully human DNA. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the phone. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything, convinced I'd see a lamp staring back at me one day. But the entries were consistent. My mom started leaving parenting pamphlets about honesty around my apartment like passive-aggressive landmines, while Patty's questions got more accusatory, asking if maybe I forgot about someone else or blacked out at a party I never attended with alcohol I never drank. I let him smell my breath every morning for a week, even gave him all my passwords. But the doubt in his eyes was poisoning everything. Word got around fast, and that same week my employer suggested I take unpaid leave because clients were uncomfortable, leaving me with no income and mounting medical bills. I was crying to my boyfriend at the local cafe when a random man walked up to our table. "I am the father of your child," he recited. Before I could respond, he continued, "Remember we hooked up at that guy's party sometime this year? You were wearing that outfit you said you love and we talked about Netflix?" Patty's chair scraped against the floor so loud everyone turned to stare. He screamed that I was either a liar or insane before walking out. I'd never seen this man before in my life. The stranger tried to follow me home holding up his phone, trying to get me to act like I knew him on camera. So I screamed, "This man is trying to touch my butt," until he finally ran away. But the damage was done. By morning, my dad had stopped returning my calls, and social services launched an investigation into my fitness as a mother, interviewing neighbors about my mental state. The caseworker's notes, which I glimpsed when she shifted her clipboard, used words like delusional and potential harm to child. Genetic specialists from Johns Hopkins flew in, running tests that had never been performed on a human before. Even my mom gave up on me after she saw protesters with signs outside their house. Update: 7 months pregnant, living on savings, I had to choose between keeping a baby that destroyed my life, adoption to strangers, or termination which felt wrong somehow. The DNA results got leaked showing anomalies inconsistent with standard human reproduction, which only fueled more conspiracy theories. And unfortunately, when I pushed the baby out, she looked completely normal. 10 fingers, 10 toes, healthy cry. It somehow made everything worse because there was still no explanation. I studied her face for hours, looking for something alien, something that would explain everything, but she just looked like my baby. My dad showed up to the hospital 2 hours later, standing in the doorway holding a teddy bear, avoiding eye contact. "She deserves family," he said, which made me smile. He moved into my studio apartment, slept on the couch, and helped with night feedings while carefully never asking about the father. We developed a routine, him holding the baby while I showered, me cooking while he did laundry, both of us avoiding the question that destroyed my entire life. At 6 weeks postpartum, I was sorting through medical bills when I found him staring at the baby with an expression I'd never seen before. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "She has your grandfather's eyes," which seemed innocent except my grandfather died before I was born and I'd never seen photos. He caught himself immediately, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. The next morning, I woke up to him on the phone whispering, "I told you never to contact me," before hanging up when he saw me. My heart dropped. I walked straight to where Dad stood by the kitchen counter still holding his phone. "Who was that?" My voice came out shaky, but I forced myself to keep going. "And what did you mean about Grandpa's eyes?" He set the phone down too carefully and picked up the baby from her bouncer. "You misheard me, honey." His hands were shaking as he adjusted her blanket. "I said she has your mother's eyes." I grabbed the counter to steady myself. "No, Dad, you said grandfather." He wouldn't look at me and kept bouncing the baby even though she wasn't crying. "You're tired and stressed, maybe you should rest." The way he avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. "Stop lying to me." My voice got louder and the baby started fussing. "Who keeps calling you?" He finally looked up and I saw something I'd never seen before in his face. Fear. Real fear. "Someone's been calling about the pregnancy." His words came out rushed. "They say they know something, but I don't know who they are." The baby started crying harder and he shifted her to his other arm. "I didn't want to worry you with crazy people." But the way his eyes darted away told me he was still lying. Something inside me snapped. "You have one chance, Dad." My hands were shaking now too. "Tell me everything or you need to leave." The words hurt coming out because I needed his help so bad. He sank onto the couch, still holding the baby. Please don't make me go. Tears started rolling down his face. I can't tell you everything yet, but I swear I'm trying to protect you both. His voice broke on the last word. There are things about our family you don't know. He wiped his face with his free hand. Things I promised never to talk about. I wanted to scream, but the baby was already upset enough. What things? He just shook his head and held the baby tighter. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Dad took his usual shift with the baby around 2 in the morning. I pretended to be asleep but watched him through barely open eyes. He whispered to her while changing her diaper, but I couldn't make out the words. Every little sound he made had me wondering what he was hiding, what he might know about how she came to exist. When he sat in the rocking chair to feed her, he kept looking over at me, like he was checking if I was really asleep. The bottle made soft sucking sounds in the dark. He hummed something that sounded like a lullaby I'd never heard before. At one point, he whispered something that sounded like, "You're safe now," but I couldn't be sure. My mind raced through every possibility, but nothing made sense. How could Dad know anything about my impossible pregnancy? Morning finally came, and I waited until he went to shower before grabbing my phone. I found Brody Hensley's number that the clinic gave me months ago. My hands shook as I dialed. Legal aid, Brody speaking. His voice was professional but kind. I explained who I was and that I needed help with custody issues. My dad's acting strange, and I'm worried he might be a threat. Saying it out loud made me feel sick. Can you come in this afternoon? I agreed and hung up just as Dad came out of the bathroom. He looked exhausted and avoided my eyes while getting dressed. The baby started crying, and we both reached for her at the same time. Our hands touched, and he pulled back like I'd burned him. "I'll make breakfast," he mumbled and went to the kitchen. The drive to Brody's office felt too long, even though it was only 20 minutes. His office was small but organized with law books covering every wall. He reviewed my thick file while I sat there sweating. "You need to document everything." He looked up from the papers. Every strange conversation. Every suspicious phone call. He leaned forward in his chair. "Social Services is still watching your case closely." My stomach dropped at that. "Any instability could hurt your custody situation." He handed me a notebook. "Write down dates, times, exact words if you can remember them." I nodded and took the notebook with shaking hands. "Record conversations if your state allows one-party consent." He pulled out his phone and showed me an app. "This one's reliable and saves to the cloud automatically." The guilt hit me immediately, but I downloaded it anyway. "I hate spying on my own dad." Brody's expression softened. "You're protecting your daughter." Back home, I set up the app while Dad was doing laundry. Every conversation we had after that felt fake. I'd start recording before asking him anything. 3 days passed with nothing useful recorded. Then while changing the baby's diaper, Dad said it again. "She really does have your grandfather's nose, too." I was folding onesies nearby and froze. "Dad, I've never seen a picture of Grandpa." My voice came out cold. "You know that." He went pale and fumbled with the diaper tabs. "There are old albums somewhere." He wouldn't meet my eyes. Family photos from before. But we both knew that was impossible. The next morning, Dad went grocery shopping, and I searched everywhere. Under his makeshift bed on the couch, through his single suitcase, even checked the bathroom cabinet. Nothing about my grandfather anywhere. I opened my laptop and typed his name into Google. The only result was an obituary from 32 years ago. No photo, just dates and a line about being survived by family. When Dad got back carrying grocery bags, I had the obituary pulled up on my phone. "Where are these photos, Dad?" I held up the screen. "The ones of Grandpa you keep mentioning?" He set the bags down slowly. "They're in storage at your mother's house." We both knew that was a lie. Mom wouldn't even answer my calls, let alone keep family photos for us. "She won't even talk to me, Dad." He started putting groceries away without responding. "Stop lying to me about this." The baby started crying from her crib, and Dad moved toward her. "I'll get her," I said, blocking his path. He backed away from me in the crib, his face looking hurt but also guilty somehow. I picked up the baby and held her close while she cried, feeling her little body shake against mine. Dad went back to putting groceries away without saying anything else, the kitchen suddenly feeling too small for both of us. The rest of the day passed with us barely talking, just going through the motions of taking care of the baby and doing chores. That evening while I was feeding her, I noticed she felt warm against my arm, warmer than usual. I touched her forehead and it was burning hot, making my stomach drop. Dad jumped up when I told him we needed to go to the hospital right now. He drove while I sat in the back holding her, watching her face turn red and feeling her temperature through her onesie. The emergency room was packed, but they took us back fast when I told them her age and temperature. The nurse checked her vitals 3 times, frowning at the numbers on the screen. The pediatrician came in looking tired until she pulled up the baby's chart on the computer. Then her whole body went stiff. She whispered something to the nurse about the prenatal records while glancing at us like we might not notice. They said they needed to run some tests to check for infection. Standard stuff. But I counted 8 vials of blood they took from her tiny arm. Dad paced the hallway outside our room, his phone pressed to his ear, turning away when I looked through the door window. When I asked who called him at the hospital, he said it was work asking about tomorrow's shift, but his hands were shaking when he put the phone away. The baby's fever broke after 3 hours on its own. No medicine needed, but the doctor said we had to stay overnight for observation just to be safe. I held the baby while they moved us to a room upstairs, passing 2 residents in the hallway who stopped talking when they saw us. Later, when Dad went to get coffee, I heard those same residents outside our door talking about how genetics wanted new samples from our case. My hands started sweating as I pretended to sleep, listening to them discuss the corrupted DNA results from before. The next morning, a woman knocked on our door carrying a thick folder and wearing a hospital badge that said, Gianna Figueroa, genetic counselor. She pulled a chair close to my bed and spread out consent forms across the rolling table, explaining they wanted to run more advanced testing on both me and the baby. Her voice was calm and professional as she went through each form, pointing out what tests they'd run and why they thought it might help understand the DNA anomalies. She mentioned something called chimerism, where a person can have 2 sets of DNA in their body, which might explain why the original tests came back corrupted. Unlike the other doctors who looked at us like we were science experiments, Gianna seemed genuinely puzzled but treated me like an actual person with feelings. She answered my questions without talking down to me, explaining that chimerism happens naturally sometimes when twin embryos merge early in pregnancy. I signed all the forms but told her I wanted copies of everything, tired of being kept in the dark about my own body and my baby's health. Gianna nodded and wrote her direct cell number on the back of her business card, saying I could call her anytime with questions. She was the first medical person to actually give me a way to contact them directly, instead of going through the hospital system. They discharged us that afternoon with instructions to follow up with our pediatrician, though the baby seemed completely fine now. Dad drove us home in silence, but I could see relief on his face when we pulled into the apartment parking lot. Back inside, he kept checking on the baby every few minutes, standing over her bouncy seat with that same weird expression from before. When I asked what he was thinking about, he just said she's perfect, and walked to the kitchen. 2 days later, I was folding laundry when someone knocked hard on our door, making the baby jump in her sleep. The social services caseworker stood there with her clipboard, saying she needed to do a home check as part of the ongoing investigation. She walked through our tiny apartment, taking notes about the sleeping arrangements, asking pointed questions about why Dad was living here. I stayed calm even though I wanted to scream at her, showing her the baby's medical records from the hospital visit and the certificate from the parenting class I took. She wrote down everything, checking the fridge for food, looking in the bathroom cabinet, even asking to see where we kept the baby's clothes. Dad sat on the couch the whole time, not saying anything but watching her every move with his jaw tight. After 40 minutes of questions and inspection, she finally left, saying she'd file her report within the week. I sat down hard on the couch feeling completely drained, realizing I needed more help than just Dad with his secrets and strange behavior. That night after Dad fell asleep, I found Jessie Norton's number from the parenting class and sent her a text asking if her support group was still meeting. She texted back within minutes saying they met every Thursday at the community center and I was welcome to join them. 3 days later, I drove to the meeting, leaving the baby with Dad even though it made me nervous. The room had 8 chairs in a circle with 4 other women already there, all looking tired but smiling when I walked in. Jessie introduced me to everyone, explaining that this was a safe space for young moms to talk about whatever they were dealing with. I sat down, and when it was my turn, I just said I was a single mom dealing with family drama, leaving out the whole virgin birth situation. Nobody pushed for more details, just nodded like they understood, and one woman even reached over to squeeze my hand. Another woman across the circle started talking about her custody battle, and pulled out this huge binder with color-coded tabs for every single thing about her kid. She flipped through pages showing receipts for diapers, printed text messages from her ex, photos of every meal she cooked, even notes about what time the baby woke up each night. The other women nodded like this was totally normal, while I sat there realizing I hadn't been keeping track of anything, except trying to survive each day. She pushed the binder toward me and pointed at sections for medical records, witness statements, and something called a parenting journal that documented every milestone. My hands felt sweaty looking at all that organization, but something in my gut told me I needed to start doing the same thing, especially with Dad acting so weird lately. After the meeting, I drove straight to the office supply store and bought folders, a label maker, and one of those accordion files that looked serious enough for court. Back at the apartment while Dad was giving the baby a bottle, I started taking pictures of everything with my phone, every receipt from the pharmacy, every formula can, even the laundry I folded. I wrote down what time she ate, how many ounces, when she needed diaper changes, and started a section just for Dad's strange behavior like the phone calls and comments about my grandfather. The next morning, while I was organizing medical bills into date order, my phone rang and Brody's name popped up on the screen. He told me Patty had finally been served with the court papers for the paternity test, but had refused to sign for them at first, until the process server explained he'd face contempt charges if he didn't comply within 30 days. I was standing in the kitchen when Dad walked in from the living room, and must have heard Patty's name because his whole face changed, and he started asking why I was wasting time on someone who obviously wasn't involved. His voice got louder than I'd heard it since moving in, saying I was just making things worse for everyone by dragging Patty through this when we both knew he couldn't be the father. The baby started crying at the noise, and Dad picked her up but kept staring at me with this look I'd never seen before, like he was angry but also scared about something. That night, I put the baby down early and pretended to fall asleep on the couch while Dad watched TV, but really I was listening and waiting. Around 11, he got up and went to the bathroom, closing the door quietly, and then I heard his voice through the thin walls, low and urgent like he was begging someone for something. I couldn't make out the actual words, but the tone made my stomach tight, especially when I heard him say something that sounded like, "Not yet," before the toilet flushed, and he came back out. The next morning, I told Dad I was taking the baby to her 2-month checkup, and he offered to come, but I said I needed to do some errands alone afterward. At the doctor's office, the nurse weighed her and measured her head, and the pediatrician listened to her heart and checked her reflexes, saying everything looked perfect for her age. She showed me the growth chart where the baby was right in the middle of normal for weight and length, which somehow made everything feel more crazy, because how could something so impossible produce such a normal baby? I was sitting in the waiting room afterward filling out insurance forms when I looked up and saw him, the same random guy from the cafe who had claimed to be the father. He was sitting across from me with an older woman who might have been his mom, and when our eyes met, his face went white, and he grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the exit. My hands started shaking as I called Brody right there in the waiting room, telling him what just happened while other parents stared at me, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. Brody said he'd add it to the restraining order file and mentioned this guy had done this before with other women who'd been in the news, showing up at their jobs or homes claiming to be involved in their situations. It didn't make me feel better knowing he was just some creep who liked attention, because it meant the real answer was still out there somewhere making my skin crawl. 2 days later, Gianna called while Dad was at the grocery store. Her voice excited as she explained my DNA results came back completely normal with no signs of chimerism or any other genetic abnormality that could explain the pregnancy. She said the baby's results were still being processed because they'd had to send them to a special lab with better equipment, but she expected those within the week and would call as soon as they arrived. Then she mentioned something that made me sit down hard on the couch, saying the original lab that had done the prenatal testing had been cited for contamination problems before, and there was actually a class action lawsuit forming against them. She gave me the lawyer's number in case I wanted to join, but said it probably wouldn't help fix my reputation since everyone already thought I was either lying or crazy, though at least maybe I'd get some money back for all the testing they'd screwed up. I grabbed my laptop that night and started digging into the lab that screwed up my prenatal testing. Their website looked professional, but the reviews told a different story. 3 other women posted about getting corrupted results in the past year, all during prenatal testing, and each case got written off as equipment failure. I screenshotted everything and made a folder on my desktop labeled Evidence before searching for lawyers who handled workplace discrimination. The first 2 wanted money up front, but the third one, a woman named Sandra, who worked out of a strip mall office, agreed to meet me for free. She looked over my termination paperwork and the emails from my boss about clients being uncomfortable. "We have a case," she said, tapping her pen on the desk. "But these things take years and the payout might not be huge." I signed the papers anyway because it was something, at least some way to fight back. The bills kept piling up on my kitchen counter, formula and diapers eating through my savings faster than I expected. I sat at the computer again, filling out the government assistance forms, each question making me feel smaller. They wanted to know about the father, about child support, about why I couldn't work, and I had to write pending paternity test over and over. Dad found me crying over the paperwork and offered to get a second job delivering pizzas at night. I told him to focus on his therapy appointments instead, the ones he'd been skipping according to the appointment cards I found in the trash. He looked away and mumbled something about rescheduling. The next week at the support group in the church basement, I was bouncing the baby on my knee when Jessie leaned over. "My sister works at the genetics lab," she whispered. "She heard about your case." My stomach dropped because of course everyone knew about the virgin birth girl. Jessie passed me a napkin with her sister's number written on it. "She wants to help," she said. I called the sister that night after putting the baby down, and she spoke in hushed tones like she was scared of being overheard. "The lab director is personally handling your file now," she said. "They've never seen DNA patterns like your baby's, but it's definitely human, just with weird markers they can't explain." She hung up quickly after that, but her words kept playing in my head. My baby was human, fully human, not some alien hybrid like the internet conspiracy nuts kept saying. I held her extra tight that night, whispering apologies into her tiny ear for ever doubting she was normal. The court date for Patty's DNA test came 2 weeks later on a rainy Tuesday morning. He showed up with both his parents and a lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than my rent. He wouldn't look at me or the baby, keeping his eyes on his phone like we were contagious or something. His mom kept shooting me dirty looks while his dad talked quietly with the lawyer. The bailiff called us into a small room where a nurse was waiting with collection kits. She explained the chain of custody rules, how the samples would be sealed and signed by everyone to prevent tampering claims. Patty went first, opening his mouth for the cheek swab while his mom watched like a hawk. Then it was the baby's turn, and she started crying the second the nurse touched her face with the swab. Patty's mom muttered something about entrapment loud enough for everyone to hear. The nurse sealed everything in special bags with tamper-proof tape, while we all signed forms confirming we witnessed the collection. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes, but felt like hours with everyone staring at me like I was trying to trap their precious son. Dad was waiting in the parking lot, engine running, and insisted on driving us home even though I had my own car there. He was quiet the whole ride, just staring at the road while the baby fussed in her car seat. When we got to my apartment, I mentioned the results would take 2 weeks. "I know," he said, not meeting my eyes, and something about how he said it made my skin prickle. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom, the first one in months, just asking if the baby was healthy. I stared at the screen for a full minute before typing back that she was perfect, and attaching a photo I'd taken that morning of her sleeping in her bassinet. 3 dots appeared and disappeared 5 times before a single heart emoji came through, the smallest possible sign that maybe she was softening. I screenshot it immediately, proof that my own mother hadn't completely written us off. The next morning, while I was changing the baby's diaper, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The victim's advocate from the courthouse explained that the stranger who'd claimed to be the father had violated his restraining order by showing up at the clinic where I'd been spotted. They were issuing a warrant, but she warned me he'd probably just get a fine unless he did something worse. I thanked her and hung up, then double-checked all the locks on our apartment door. Over the next few days, I threw myself into creating routines with the baby, desperate for some kind of normal in all this chaos. Wake up at 6 for her first feeding, then tummy time on the blanket Dad bought while I ate toast. She'd started smiling now, these tiny little grins that made my chest hurt with how much I loved her. Every smile felt like proof to everyone who thought I should give her up that we belonged together. I took photos of each one, building evidence that I was a good mom despite everything. Thursday afternoon, Gianna called while the baby was napping, her voice excited instead of the usual professional tone. She wanted to schedule another appointment to go over the baby's full genetic results, mentioning something about possibly publishing a case study if I'd consent to it. I agreed to come in Monday, curious what had her so interested. When Monday came, Dad insisted on driving us, even though I had my own car. Gianna met us in the genetics department waiting room, practically bouncing with energy as she led us to a consultation room. She spread out charts and graphs across the table, pointing to sequences I didn't understand while explaining the baby had unusual genetic markers suggesting rapid mutation in certain areas. Nothing harmful, she kept emphasizing, just different in ways they'd never documented before. She theorized it might be some kind of evolutionary adaptation, though she couldn't say to what exactly. The scientific fascination in her voice didn't bother me as much as I expected. At least someone saw my daughter as special instead of proof I was either lying or crazy. She asked again about publishing, promising to keep all identifying information private, and I signed the consent forms. 2 weeks later, Dad came with me to the next custody hearing, both of us in our nicest clothes while the baby wore the little dress Mom had sent. Social Services presented their monthly report to the judge, noting improvement in stability, but expressing ongoing concern about the unusual circumstances and various investigations. The caseworker kept glancing at me while she read, like she was waiting for me to snap or something. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, seemed sympathetic as she reviewed the paperwork. She complimented me on completing the parenting classes and maintaining stable housing, but then her expression got serious. Any criminal charges related to false reporting or fraud could affect custody, she warned, looking directly at me. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, wanting to scream that I'd done nothing wrong no matter what everyone thought. Dad's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. After we left the courthouse, Dad suggested we stop for ice cream even though it was barely noon. As I fed the baby tiny tastes of vanilla from my cone, he brought up the idea of moving somewhere new once everything settled. Start fresh where nobody knew our story, he said, watching me carefully. The idea was tempting, a chance to raise my daughter without whispers and stares, but it also felt like running away from answers I still needed. I told him I'd think about it. That afternoon, while the baby was down for her second nap, my phone rang with Brody's number. His voice was urgent as he told me shocking news about the stranger who'd claimed paternity at the cafe. Police had arrested him for harassment in another case, and when they searched his apartment, they found evidence he'd been stalking multiple women involved in publicized pregnancies. He had notebooks full of details about cases that made the news, practicing stories about being the father. My case was in there, with notes about my schedule and printed articles about the virgin birth claims. Brody said this would help my credibility significantly, especially with the custody case. Even the social services caseworker would have to admit the harassment wasn't my fault, or some delusion I'd created. It was a small win, but I'd take anything positive at this point. I hung up and immediately called Dad at work to tell him, and his relief was obvious even over the phone. Maybe things were finally starting to turn around. Just a little bit. The caseworker called 2 days later and actually sounded different on the phone, less cold and more like a normal person. She said the police report about the stalker helped my case, and she was updating her notes to reflect that the harassment wasn't something I'd made up or caused. 3 more days passed with Dad and me falling into our weird routine of taking care of the baby while avoiding talking about anything real. Thursday morning, I was feeding the baby when I heard the mail truck outside and something made me check right away. There it was, a certified mail envelope that needed my signature, and I knew before opening it what it had to be. My hands shook as I signed for it and brought it inside where Dad was pretending to wash the same dish for the third time. The return address was the lab, and the envelope felt heavier than it should, like it was carrying the weight of everything that had happened. I sat at the kitchen table and tore it open while Dad kept his back to me, but I could see his shoulders tense up. The cover letter had a bunch of legal language, but I skipped to the results page and there it was in black and white. Paternity probability 99.9% match to Patrick James Sullivan, which was Patty's full name that I'd almost forgotten. My brain couldn't process what I was reading because we'd never had sex. Not once. Not even close to it. I read it 3 more times and the numbers didn't change. Just sat there being impossible on the official letterhead. Dad turned around and saw my face and came over to read over my shoulder. His eyebrows went up, but he didn't say anything. Just put his hand on my shoulder while I stared at the paper. I grabbed my phone and called Gianna's direct number that she'd given me at the hospital. She answered on the second ring, and I just blurted out that the results showed Patty was the father, but that was impossible. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if we'd ever been intimate in other ways, even without actual intercourse. I felt my face get hot talking about this stuff, but told her yes. We'd done other things, but always been careful about not going all the way. She explained that pre-ejaculate during intimate contact could rarely cause pregnancy, like 1 in a million rare, but it did happen. The medical term was splash conception or something like that, and suddenly everything clicked into place. All those times we'd fooled around but stopped before actual sex, being so careful, but apparently not careful enough. The relief hit me so hard I started crying while still holding the phone. Gianna kept talking about how unusual but not impossible it was, citing some study from Europe where they'd documented similar cases. I thanked her and hung up and just sat there holding the baby while tears ran down my face. Dad came over and wrapped his arms around both of us, and I heard him whisper that he knew she was meant to be here. We stayed like that for a few minutes until the baby started fussing and needed a diaper change. I took a photo of the results with my phone and forwarded them to Patty's lawyer with a formal request for child support. The lawyer had given me his email at the DNA collection and said to contact him when results came in. I didn't write much, just that the results were attached, and I was requesting financial support as established by state guidelines. The amount wouldn't be much since Patty was still in the school, but it was about him acknowledging his daughter now, not the money. Within an hour, Patty's lawyer emailed back confirming receipt and saying his client would need time to review the results. 2 days later, Brody called saying Patty wanted to meet to discuss co-parenting arrangements now that paternity was established. I agreed, but told Brody I wanted it at his office with both lawyers there, not some coffee shop where things could go bad. We scheduled it for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock when Dad could watch the baby. The meeting day came and I wore my nicest outfit that still fit and tried to look put together even though I'd been up all night with the baby. Patty was already there when I arrived, sitting next to his lawyer and looking at his phone. He looked up when I walked in and his face was hard to read. Not angry anymore, but not happy either. His lawyer started talking about how this was an unusual situation and everyone needed to be reasonable. Patty finally spoke up and said he was sorry for not believing me and for how he'd acted. He said the whole thing was just so impossible to understand and he'd reacted badly, but he accepted the results. He pulled out a paper and slid it across the table, a bank statement showing he'd already set up monthly automatic payments. The amount was small, just $200, but he said it would increase when he graduated and got a real job. He also said he wasn't ready to be an actual dad yet, needed time to process everything, but he'd meet his financial obligations. I looked at the paper and then at him, and realized how tired I was of fighting about everything. I told him I accepted his terms and we could revisit actual parenting later if he wanted. The lawyers drew up a basic agreement that we both signed and Patty left without saying anything else. Brody said I'd done the right thing and that Patty might come around eventually once the shock wore off. The next week I had another meeting with social services for their final review of my case. The caseworker had all my documents spread out on her desk, including the paternity results and the custody agreement. She looked through everything carefully, then looked up at me with an actual smile on her face. She said she'd never seen anything like this case in 20 years, but all the documentation checked out. The investigation was officially closed and she was recommending no further action needed. She even said good luck with the baby as I left, which felt like a small miracle after everything. The employment lawyer called 2 days later saying my old boss wanted to settle out of court rather than face discrimination charges. The offer wasn't huge, just $15,000 plus a neutral reference letter, but it covered 3 months of medical bills and bought me breathing room. I signed the papers at her office while the baby slept in her carrier, watching my signature shake a little from exhaustion. Dad picked us up afterward, and on the drive home he kept clearing his throat like he wanted to say something important. Finally, at a red light, he turned to me and said the calls were from his brother Frank, who I'd never even heard of before. Frank had been calling about some genetic thing that ran in our family, something about women having weird pregnancies, but Dad cut him off years ago over money stuff. He started crying right there in traffic saying he should have told me sooner, but was scared I'd think our family was cursed or something. I reached over and squeezed his hand, because honestly, after everything that happened, finding out about some uncle with a grudge seemed pretty minor. We got home and I told him he could stay as long as we were honest with each other from now on. No more secrets about anything. He nodded and promised to call Frank back, maybe get some actual answers about this genetic thing he mentioned. The next week, Jessie from the support group organized a little party at her apartment to celebrate me keeping custody. 5 women showed up with cake and baby clothes, all of them single moms who understood what fighting the system felt like. Jessie pulled me aside and offered to babysit whenever I started job hunting, said her daughter was old enough to help and loved babies. These women had become more like family than my actual family, showing up when everyone else disappeared. Gianna sent an email with a PDF attachment of her published case study about my pregnancy. All names changed to protect privacy, obviously. Reading it felt weird, seeing my nightmare turned into medical language about spontaneous conception via minimal genetic material transfer and laboratory contamination factors. She described everything as a perfect storm of tiny probability events. Nothing supernatural, just really bad luck with timing and lab errors. The case study gave me closure somehow. Like science finally admitted weird stuff happens without anyone being crazy or lying. 3 weeks later, Brody called about a data entry job one of his clients needed filled. Work from home, $20 an hour. Not amazing money, but I could do it while the baby napped and slowly rebuild my savings account. I started the next Monday, setting up my laptop at the kitchen table while Dad took the baby for walks. The work was boring, entering insurance claims all day, but boring felt good after months of chaos and drama. 6 months had passed since that first ultrasound that destroyed my life, and now I had a routine that almost felt normal. Dad cooked dinner while I worked. We took turns with night feedings, and slowly the baby started sleeping longer stretches. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Mom showed up at the door holding a bag of groceries and looking everywhere except at me. She picked up the baby super awkwardly, like she'd forgotten how to hold one, but I saw her eyes get wet when the baby grabbed her finger. She didn't say sorry or explain why she abandoned me, just started putting groceries away and asked if I had laundry that needed doing. We worked in silence, her folding tiny onesies while I fed the baby, both of us pretending this was totally normal. She stayed for 3 hours, held her granddaughter, brought in more groceries from her car, then left saying she'd come back next week. After she drove away, I sat in the baby's room just watching her sleep in the crib Dad had assembled last month. The apartment was small but clean, bills were getting paid, and we had a routine that worked even if it wasn't perfect. I thought about everything that happened, the accusations, the abandonment, the strangers claiming to be the father, the DNA tests that made no sense. The truth turned out to be stupidly simple, just weird biology and lab mistakes, but it took destroying my entire life to get there. The baby stirred in her sleep, making those little noises that still amazed me, completely unaware of the chaos she'd caused just by existing. Looking at her peaceful face, surrounded by the stable life we'd built from nothing, I knew we'd make it through whatever came next. The medical mystery was solved, the legal stuff was handled, and even my family was slowly coming back together in their own messed up way. We weren't some perfect family from a movie, just 3 generations figuring it out day by day, but that was enough for now. Well, that's gonna do it for now. Thanks for just being here and exploring all these curious details with me. Always enjoy sharing this time with you. Subscribe for more content like this.